I arrived in Canada just after the maple leaf flag had been adopted and that strange national pastime was underway, asking, what does it mean to be a Canadian? In fact, almost immediately that question was being answered all over the country by artists. In Newfoundland, audiences were laughing to Codco. In Quebec, crowds were singing the songs of Gilles Vigneault. Out on the West Coast, the traditions of carving and dancing were being revived spectacularly by the Kwakiutl and Haida people. But those were examples really of people saying, this is who we've always been, and now we want to assert it. In the part of the country where I live, on the prairies, the high plains, something very different was happening in the way of consciousness forming, because people were taking from what existed in the colonial past and building their own consciousness out of it. And then the quaintly named town of Moose Jaw, a particular energy was being hatched by a group of people who called themselves the Moose Jaw movement with a kind of mocking defiance, but in fact opened up a whole sense of the awareness of what language could do and say for a people in a certain part of the world. The Moose Jaw Festival of the Words is a uniquely friendly event, based on the insistence that writing is speech, that reading is listening, and that writers and readers are each other's guests. It's been 11 years and growing, and it comes out of something, a particular energy from this part of the world. Last night, I had the privilege and delight of spending an hour with the original members of the Moose Jaw movement in a reunion from their inception in 1975.
It's like the leave, you know, like Archimedes.
Remarkable, funny, unpretentious, brilliant people. And at their heart, Gary Hyland, who really is the heart and soul of this festival. The name of Gary Hyland recurs in all these memories as the energy center of the movement and of as much that has evolved in the province's literary world, including the Moose Jaw Festival of Words, where this year many of the original group gathered to be with Gary, cruelly smitten with Lou Gehrig's disease, but undiminished in gaiety and purpose.
So this is called Stakes in the River. 1. Time stolen is the best time. 2. Holding on to afternoons is the hardest holding. 3. Staying home, the most demanding journey.
Were you fighting a battle, or was it just something that was waiting to happen?
Well, it was something that was waiting to happen, but I wasn't conscious of fighting a battle, although I often thought of it as leading a revolution, which was to say, I'd come back to Saskatchewan. I'd spent a couple of years abroad working in journalism and whatnot. I went to England to write, to become a writer, right? And but I come back kind of humbled from that experience, and I fell in love with province, and the people here, and including my family, in a way that I hadn't really thought would happen. So I just determined that I would write, right? Like I would be a writer, and here. Wasn't never my ambition to go to Toronto or New York or even back to London or any of those places to be a writer. You could do it here.
Ken had the ideas. It was his idea to start retreats. It was his idea to start grade. Probably the Guild, for all I know. So he made things happen. He gave us the ideas, and we ran with them, and we ran hard and far.
People who were left of center politically Ken Mitchell was an example at that time, coming out of a socialist background in Moose Jaw, you know, and people in broadcasting. Ken got together with Jean Freeman, you may have heard of her, and people like that to form the Writers Guild. And it was very much a self-help thing, and very much in the spirit of the cooperative movement that had taken hold in Saskatchewan. So I think a lot of that happened.
That communitarian element is essential, but I would say that's essential to all of Saskatchewan, sort of values and this cultural movement that's gone on, not specifically in Moose Jaw.
Well, for me, my writing experience began here in Regina. I think I was 16 or 17. I took a creative writing class from Ken Mitchell at the university. And that was the year that the Writers Guild was formed. And so there was a nucleus of writers here in Regina who got together, and a lot of things started to happen in the province once the guild was officially formed.
I self-consciously took a kind of an activist role in that, and getting it set up and organized, something that would identify writing as a professional craft and an art worthy of support from not just the arts agencies, but the people in the community of Saskatchewan. So we all came together and did that. That's, if the Moose Jaw movement or the literary had a beginning point, it would have been that, I think.
Well, you know, it really started out at the Summer School of the Arts. We started meeting in my room at noon hours.
We were sitting around in, I think it was Bob Curry's bedroom, all sitting on the cot, you know, talking about poetry.
None of us had published. When someone wrote a poem, and usually Lorna, and ran down the hall waving the poem, from our rooms, we cheered. It was the writing that was important.
So there were these three male Western writers, Mandel, Weave, and, four, Mitchell and Croach, who would have great discussions during the night. And we all felt we had a naive confidence. We just barreled in there and argued and sang and danced and drank at the local pub and became writers together.
Always remember this moment. Scriver had written a poem about a hockey player and describing him with armor like a knight of old. And Croach listened to the poem and he says, "Steve, why don't you describe him as if he were a hockey player?" And something just snapped there, and Scriver went away and started writing those hockey poems that made him famous, you know, and he telling it the way it was for hockey players, right in the dressing room and out there on the ice. And you know, it was one of those moments where you sort of felt light bulbs going on all around the room. Well, Lorna and I thought, gee, this is really good, and we figured we want to keep something like this going.
And it was so heady. It was like we were, the air was champagne, you know, around the Qu'Appelle Valley. Everything was alive with language and non-bull language about where we were from.
4, time begrudged the saddest time. 5, time accelerates travel. 6, despair says, I cannot do it all. Joy says, I cannot do it all.
I think SALT was connected to the sense of community that grew up at Fort Sand, because Bob Curry had been editing SALT on his own out of Moose Jaw.
No, it was Bob on his own, getting piles of submissions from across the country and reading them and sorting them and choosing them. And then on his faithful Gestetner at the high school, cranking out the issues and hand-drawing the covers himself.
He just converted from pharmacy to teaching English. And he contacted me and wanted to know if I could help him with this magazine called SALT. Well, I helped a little bit, but I really wasn't much help to him with his new magazine. I have to confess I was reticent about, I was lacking confidence in what I could do and how I could help him. And, but we started to exchange poetry just between the two of us.
Yeah, I felt kind of cut off from the world, you know, when I went to the U of S. I could go to the library and there were all kinds of journals there and everything, and there wasn't much in the Moose Jaw library. And I'd read this one out of Montreal called Intercourse, and it was a kind of a crummy-looking magazine that was just done on Gestetner as well, I think. You know, this is long before computers where anybody can turn out something that looks really professional. And when I saw that, I thought, hey, maybe I could do something like that.
Were Gary and Bob a kind of partnership in your eyes at that time?
They were already the Gary and Bob show, we used to call them. They were going around to schools and doing reading Saskatchewan writing. Bob and Gary were an interesting pair because they were so very different. But neither of them played pool.
We used to do a thing called the Bob and Gary Show. Somebody gave it that name, where we went around to library conferences and things like that and did readings of various Saskatchewan writers to try and introduce a larger public to all the good writers that were in this province.
Was that a mission?
Mission's probably too strong of a word.
Okay, what would you use?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we did feel strongly that we were doing something important there.
7. Love and time are one. 8. Distance becomes time, nibbles love.
When you guys began, it was mostly poetry, wasn't it?
It was.
Why was poetry so important?
I think because we all had other jobs and we could work in the poetry in smaller segments of time than the novelists could. You know, when we look back, though, our mentors were people like Eli Mandel and John Newlove, who'd moved away, both to Ontario initially, and they were both poets.
Do you mean mentors or do you mean models?
I mean models, really. But although Mandel came back and mentored people here, he did do workshops.
What was he telling you?
He was telling us there were no rules to poetry. The poetry had to be approached with abandon and worry about discipline later.
If you were going to describe the meetings you had together, how would you?
Well, they were a lot of fun, and we usually had something to drink.
Well, I remember the moonlight. It was being the only car in the road at 2 in the morning. And I swear there were coyotes howling, but probably not.
So I drive up with a case of beer, and everyone would bring beer and poems.
We very quickly got on to sending poems around the room and going person by person.
We were hypercritical with each other, but not in a nasty way. We'd find a sort of an easeful way of saying what we thought was wrong with the poem, but we didn't let anybody get away with anything. And that was really the height of my life. You know, I was teaching high school in Swift Current. I was in a marriage I knew I wanted to get out of, and I wasn't sure how I was going to do that yet. And driving that 2 hours down that long road that has one bend in it to meet with my fellow poets was just totally thrilling.
Lorna was living in Swift Current. A couple of us were based here in Regina. Most of the crew were in Moose Jaw. We became the Moose Jaw movement.
It's not poopy at all, the name. It's the goddess Cloacina and the satires of Pope and Dryden. That's what it's all about.
We took that name kind of defiantly when we started to do public readings. They thought, they being people outside the province who heard of the Moose Jaw movement, that we really had a philosophy, an approach to writing, something like the Black Mountain School or Tisch. And we had nothing of that sort. And there was so much disparity and variety in our group, you know. There was no commonality at all.
Oh, it had plenty of variety. When you think of the sort of intense lyric poetry of Judy Krause, for instance, and you put that against the anecdotal, emotional expansiveness of Bob Curry, and you set it against the political stuff that I was doing, or the material that Barbara was writing about her Romanian background, it's just widely divergent. There was no real homogeneity to this. There was a process of dealing with the material at meetings of the poetry group.
We wrote because we had to have something to show at the meeting. And then we were together, and Lorna Crozier, who was then Lorna Ewer, would say things like, if she didn't like it, it's a crock. And if she did like it, she'd say, aren't we wonderful?
But it made me have a goal to writing. I was writing poems for them, you know, and I was seeing their eyes looking at my work and saying, no, you're sentimental here. Or Ed saying, you know, why don't you think of using a space instead of a comma here, or a virgule, you know, a slash, and all this kind of stuff. So we were, I think, living up to each other's expectations and high demands, and it made all of us better poets.
I didn't know anything. I was straight out of mathematics, and I was changing gears. And so all I knew was logic and the law of the excluded middle and the undecidability of certain computing processes.
And they are, after all, as we all learn, simply words on a page. And you can put different words on a page than the ones you've got there.
Or you can change a word.
Or you can change a word. You know, you can change the poem. You don't have to worry about that.
We all move that stuff around on the page. That's what we did. And we all tried to move it around as well as we could and shape it as well as we could. And, you know, I suppose that's being rigorous.
Well, there was rigor because none of us wanted to support less than quality work. And we knew from having had great instructors at the School of the Arts that the only way we were going to do that was to cut to a true response to the work and not worry too much about hurting each other's feelings.
It was hard to take. You know, you're making notes and you're shaking as you listen to this critique of your work. You never thought of looking at it that way. You never thought you'd have failed it this way, but you had, invariably. You'd come away with new ways to try your poem, you know. Especially at first, I didn't always incorporate all the suggestions I received, and it never did really fully. But it gives you something else to consider, another way of looking at it. And you know, I learned to throw away a lot of poetry, a lot of it. Thank God.
In one sense, it was kind of political because we wanted to say you didn't have to live in Toronto or Montreal to be a poet. You could come from a place with a screwy name like Moose Jaw and you could still write poetry.
There is something about Moose Jaw. I don't know what it is exactly. Well, my theory is that Moose Jaw is so different from every other city, including Regina and Saskatoon. It's an industrial town in an agricultural province, and it also sort of so there's a lot of immigrant people there, most are Eastern European and whatnot, but also Asian, and it just has a very different mix and feel. It's kind of it's always been a political hotbed too.
There's a really strong union tradition, really strong politics. People are always saying politics is a blood sport in Saskatchewan. Well, probably Moose Jaw is the epicenter of that. Really strongly defined class differences.
And seeing itself, the community has seen itself as kind of different or special or outrageous in a way because of the name, you know, all the Moose Jaw jokes and everything like that. That's the only way I can explain why all of the people, you know, Jeff Ursel and Barbara and Gary and Bob and many, many others, just all of these people came from one part of Moose Jaw, that is South Hill, the immigrant section again. And others have had more, I'm sure, interesting or eloquent things to say about this, but it's an odd fact. You know, if you're going to put it in Ripley's or something like that, that all of these people came from, basically went to 2 schools, but one neighborhood, one section of the city. And collectively made a big impact on this question of Saskatchewan culture.
9. For a time you sat on God's lap. When was that? 10. Genius is giving others the kind of time they need. 11. I cannot touch you without touching time. 12. You confess to squandering time to validate your potential. 13. A still night, stones fall from the wall of memory. 14. Drudgery degrades time. 15. A wound that does not heal over time is not a wound, it is you.
I remember a trip to Winnipeg where we were going to show those bastards in Winnipeg. We rented a van and we were going to show them what prairie writing was all about, we thought. I don't think we showed anybody anything, quite frankly, but we did have the attitude.
There was a lot of that in Caddo. I mean, I would guess that half my motivation was based on that. The other half being a fondness for here and for the writers. You know, when I first read Lois Simme's short stories, I thought, wow, she's from here, and we're going to publish these. I was just thrilled.
And there was a certain sense of, let's teach those Eastern bastards something, you know. But there were a lot of people who thought, you know, maybe McClellan and Stewart will never publish me, but Caddo will, and Thistledown will, and I'll get my poems in grain, and we'll show them that there's an energy and a vitality here that the big Eastern cities are lacking. It really was a Renaissance feeling.
Caddo was going to provide a place for people to publish who could not get published in Ontario. The growth of the small presses happened mainly in English-speaking Ontario. The English-speaking small presses happened mainly in Ontario to begin with, but we saw that there should be no reason whatsoever why there shouldn't be some cultural infrastructure, as we called it, in Saskatchewan as well.
Well, I think that there was a very strong sense that our work was overlooked, that we were discounted as, you know, some kind of stubble jumpers, you know, people who were naive, unsophisticated, without interesting stories to tell, without voices that offered anything to the world. And we knew that that was not true.
And in '78, when we did what I think is a really good anthology of poetry up to that time here, called Number One Northern, it was dismissed by reviewers as, quote, prairie green elevator poems, which just pisses you off hugely.
16. How fast from a door to a bore. 17. Time heals as snow heals, one color that blurs and blunts. 18. They give most who give time.
In school, I was really not, you might say, not a good student. I didn't learn much in school, except, as I sometimes say, how to learn. I learned to hate poetry and Shakespeare in high school.
I'd been educated like every other Saskatchewan kid, educated for a different place and a different time. You know, no sooner did we drop off our English forebears and wordsmiths than we were inundated by Americans. So,
what was available for you to teach as literature to kids in Moose Jaw in the 60s and 70s?
Very little Canadian literature. There was none on the course. It virtually didn't exist. So I, along with others, was lobbying for a Canadian component to the program. Otherwise, there was the usual thing of Shakespeare, Chaucer, classical literature, up to, I guess the most modern would be Swinburne.
Did the kids respond differently once you changed the curriculum?
They did. They did. I mean, it was more where they're from, and the poetry. We could bring in poetry of contemporary poets, you know. So I was bringing Bob Curry poetry. I was bringing Andy Signatsky poetry. I was bringing Andy into the classroom and Bob into the classroom. Well, that makes a huge difference. All of a sudden, the material is immediate, it's alive, and they can see that these are people. These are people that they could emulate if they wanted to.
Well, Gary, I think, from the beginning, has had the energy of three. When I think back to who came up with the ideas and who pushed to make it happen, oftentimes I would have to say it was Gary. Gary was the push. Sometimes Bob was the voice of reason. He'd say, yes, but what about? Or how are we going to make this work?
Oh, scared the hell out of me at first, I think. Yeah. How were we going to be able to do this in Moose Jaw and make it work?
When you first heard about the Festival of the Word, what did you think?
Well, I thought Gary was nuts to get that started, and yet at the same time I thought what a wonderful thing for Saskatchewan and the community of people in this province who love literature, whether they produce it themselves or simply want to hear it, read it, enjoy it, share it. You know, there are a lot of lovers of reading and books who come. Many are teachers. So it seemed to me an enormous undertaking that Gary was spearheading. But if anybody could do it, I knew Gary was the guy that would pull it off.
What he's done in the community is unprecedented, really, in Moose Jaw, in the town of Moose Jaw. Basically, he's become the Lord of the arts.
He's amazing the way he goes at stuff. But he was a tremendous teacher, you know, and very original. And
this is what he brings to the group. This is what he brings to his own work. This is what he brings to Saskatchewan.
Only he could have done it.
Gary, do you ever feel that all the energy you've put into so many other things has restricted the amount of poetry you could write?
It has. It has.
Any regrets about that?
No, because in some ways, that's another form of poetry. It's another form of creativity, anyways. It's facetious to call it poetry, but it's creativity. And in many ways, it's going to accomplish, in a very different way, as much, you know. So getting the cultural center built in Moose Jaw was, it took a lot of my time, a tremendous amount of my time. But that building's going to be there for 50, 60 years at least. And lots of wonderful things are going to happen there, including the Festival of Words, you know. So, no, I don't regret it. No. I think, from my point of view, I've only got so much poetry in me anyways. And maybe 2 or 3 more books, if I'm lucky. 19. The writer craves your time. You crave. 20. Try not to hear what is not said before it is not said. 21. Seeking to comprehend time is time lost. 22. Art undoes time, a stake in the river. 23. The last interruption forestalls all others. 24. In the end, enough time has elapsed since the start.
I've done what I've had to do. I've never been so far away from you. I traveled off so far. Could barely find the words to say I'm coming home to you. I'll get home to you when I'm through. Until then,